They laughed when they first saw the will. Not politely, not out of curiosity, but the kind of scoffing that comes from absolute certainty. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms with a smirk that said, "This is going to be easy." The siblings whispered, trading knowing glances, their faces a mixture of amusement and entitlement. They had imagined this day countless times. The reading of Mom's will, the moment her assets were parceled out, the way they would finally receive their due. To them, the will was a formality, a predictable script in a story they believed they were the protagonists of. They never considered that Mom, in her quiet wisdom, had written a plot twist they weren't prepared for. They assumed the ending was theirs, that the narrative of family legacy was simply a delivery mechanism for their satisfaction. But the room, solemn and heavy with expectation, would soon prove them spectacularly wrong. The lawyer, a woman in her late 40s with an air of composure that demanded attention, cleared her throat. Her presence alone shifted the room's energy. This wasn't some casual gathering. This was a formal moment that would define futures. She opened the envelope carefully, the paper inside crisp, as if it had been preserved for centuries. Eyes darted, whispers escalated, and he chuckled again, shaking his head as though the notion of being surprised was absurd. "Mom wouldn't," he started, but the lawyer raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Silence followed, the kind that makes people lean forward involuntarily, sensing that something they hadn't accounted for was about to happen. It was in that silence that the first seeds of tension took root, subtle but undeniable. Mom's voice wasn't present in the room, yet her presence was palpable. It lingered in the corners, in the family photos, in the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to the curtains. Her life had been orderly, precise, and intelligent, but also unpredictable in the smallest, most cunning ways. The children had grown accustomed to her patterns, the predictable routines, the polite refrains. They assumed they knew her thinking, her priorities, her rules. That assumption was about to be shattered, not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, surgically, in the way only someone who understands timing and leverage can orchestrate. The lawyer began reading the more conventional parts first. The distribution of personal items, sentimental mementos, photographs, small accounts. The room relaxed momentarily. Laughter returned, whispers resumed, jokes about who would get which antique or jewelry piece. They believed these mundane details were the most challenging aspects. Little did they know those were merely appetizers. The main course, the explosive clause, was coming. And with it, a shift in every expectation they had carefully constructed over decades. Then, with deliberate calm, the lawyer's tone changed slightly. She paused, then continued, enunciating the words with measured precision, almost ceremoniously. A clause buried several pages in, tucked behind legal jargon that no one except the trained eye would have noticed. The wording was unambiguous, yet elegantly constructed, a directive that would reallocate the bulk of the estate under conditions they had never considered. The first sign of panic flashed across their faces, not loud, not immediate, but subtle. A tightening of the jaw, a sharp intake of breath, a stifled cough. The smirk he had worn, the certainty in his eyes, wavered. It was the first crack in the armor of entitlement, the first acknowledgement that this reading wasn't the predictable performance they had rehearsed in their minds. The clause stipulated that the primary beneficiary, once considered himself secure, would only receive the inheritance under conditions that involved transparency, responsibility, and proof of initiative. Simple, ordinary instructions disguised as legal text, but the implications were revolutionary. To them, it read like a challenge, a rebuke, and an interrogation all at once. They whispered amongst themselves, trying to rationalize, trying to bend the meaning back into a narrative that suited their pride. The lawyer, however, read each word with steady rhythm, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Each word carried weight, precision, and undeniable authority. He attempted to interrupt, tried to assert his expectations with a force born from years of assumption, years of believing in a predetermined outcome. "This isn't," he began, but she didn't pause, didn't hesitate. Her eyes met his, calm and unwavering. "Please allow me to finish," she said, her voice gentle but firm. That phrase, so simple, disarmed him more effectively than any argument could. It was a subtle power move, a reminder that authority in that room came from understanding the structure of the will, not from familial posturing. The room fell into a tense quiet again, the kind that makes everyone present hyper-aware of their own reactions, of their own expectations collapsing in real time. As the lawyer continued, the clause unfolded with clarity. The inheritance was conditional, yes, but not in arbitrary ways. It demanded accountability, foresight, and action. It rewarded initiative, consistency, and demonstration of value beyond mere claim. He looked around at his siblings, their faces pale, mouths slightly open, disbelief mingling with a dawning understanding. Mom had anticipated their greed, their entitlement, their assumptions. She had designed this clause not just to test them, but to reveal them, to expose the hollowness of certainty when confronted with strategy, patience, and intelligence. It wasn't merely a financial device, it was a moral lens, and they were all on display. Their murmurs escalated, frantic, scattered, desperate attempts to reinterpret, to negotiate, to find loopholes in a text they had previously ignored. The lawyer, however, remained steadfast. She had seen this before, a family unprepared for subtle genius, an inheritance designed as a puzzle, an entitlement running headlong into principle. There would be no shortcuts, no reinterpretations that could override the clear intent. Every whispered strategy they attempted was met with unflinching adherence to the will's precise language. Panic, subtle at first, now began to ripple outward. Mom's foresight wasn't just in the legal drafting, it was in timing. She had positioned the clause several pages into the will, after the reading of trivial items, so that her children's focus would be lulled, their attention dulled by sentimentality. By the time they reached the explosive part, their guard was down, their assumptions fully formed, their sense of control absolute. That miscalculation, built entirely on their own overconfidence, became their undoing. The power wasn't in the lawyer's reading. It was in Mom's anticipation, in her ability to think several moves ahead, to encode consequence in plain sight without raising suspicion. He could no longer maintain composure. The laughter had vanished entirely, replaced by tension, calculation, and a dawning realization that the narrative he had authored in his mind, the certainty of entitlement, was unraveling in real time. The lawyer's voice, steady, calm, unwavering, became the soundtrack to a quiet revelation. They had misjudged her entirely. Mom had played a game they didn't even know existed, had written rules they hadn't been instructed to follow, and had positioned herself as the arbiter of fairness, foresight, and accountability. In that moment, entitlement met consequence, and consequence was heavier than any expectation they had carried into that room. He swallowed hard, trying to mask the sudden spike of anxiety with a forced smirk that didn't reach his eyes. The siblings shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that were no longer playful, no longer confident. Every assumption they had relied on the idea that Mom's estate was simply a matter of division, that their claims were automatic, that entitlement equaled inheritance, was now collapsing before them. He tried to speak, to assert authority born of familiarity and age, but the words stuck in his throat. The clause was precise, and precision leaves no room for improvisation. His certainty was the first casualty, and he felt it immediately, a cold realization seeping into every nerve. He had underestimated her. The lawyer paused, letting the weight of the clause settle before continuing. It was a strategic silence, a gentle insistence on attention. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't dramatizing. She simply allowed the moment to breathe, and in that breathing space, comprehension began to dawn. The room, once buzzing with whispered plans and anticipatory humor, was now suffused with quiet tension. Each sibling was calculating, measuring, adjusting to a reality they hadn't anticipated. Mom had anticipated them. Every detail they had dismissed, every word they had ignored, every assumption they had made was now evidence of their own oversight. He leaned back again, this time not in confidence but in disbelief. The clause required more than a passive claim. It demanded initiative, planning, proof of contribution, and demonstration of integrity over time. Simple words, but their implications were seismic. It wasn't enough to show up, to expect, to assume. The inheritance, the very thing they had spent years counting on, was now contingent upon their actions aligning with standards they hadn't realized existed. It was a quiet reckoning, a lesson embedded in legal language that carried moral weight far beyond the dollar amounts. Whispers erupted, hushed yet urgent. "Did you hear that?" one sibling asked, voice tight with confusion. "What does it mean exactly?" Another leaned forward, trying to parse the text, searching for loopholes, but the clarity of the lawyer's reading left no ambiguity. They had assumed complexity equaled manipulability, that legal jargon could be exploited, but Mom had built clarity into subtlety. Every sentence had purpose, every clause a calculated measure of foresight. Their laughter, their mockery, their certainty. It was all gone, replaced by apprehension and the faintest tremor of fear. He tried again, attempting to assert his version of events. "She can't mean this is ridiculous," he exclaimed, voice louder than intended, revealing desperation he hadn't meant to show. The lawyer didn't react, maintaining an unwavering calm that only accentuated the shift in dynamics. Her neutrality was her power. In the courtroom of logic and preparation, emotion is irrelevant. This moment wasn't about negotiation or argument, it was about comprehension. And comprehension had just redefined the room. Each sibling processed the revelation differently. Some scanned the clause repeatedly, looking for wording that might be misconstrued, anything that would let them return to the comfortable assumption that inheritance was entitlement. Others froze, the weight of realization pressing in, their plans suddenly meaningless without the proper alignment with the will's conditions. He was the most vocal, but even his bravado faltered under the careful weight of the lawyer's articulation. The clause wasn't punitive, it wasn't cruel. It was deliberate, exact, and designed to ensure that only those capable of responsibility would benefit. Mom's foresight was extraordinary. She had embedded not just conditions but a philosophy. The clause wasn't merely about money, it was about proving character, about testing judgment, patience, and initiative. She had spent decades observing their behaviors, recording habits, and understanding tendencies. Every laugh, every argument, every instance of entitlement had informed the structure of this document. To anyone else, it might have seemed unnecessarily complicated. To her, it was perfect. She had engineered not only the distribution of assets, but the revelation of true character. The room fell into a tense silence as comprehension spread. He glanced around, realizing that the other siblings were no longer allies, no longer co-conspirators in assumed privilege. Each was now navigating their own reckoning. The collective confidence that had dominated the past years evaporated, replaced by private calculations of possibility and risk. He had assumed the clause could be challenged, that influence could be leveraged, that charm and persistence would bend the words to his will. Now, all those strategies felt impotent, irrelevant in the face of premeditated foresight and legal precision. The lawyer continued reading, moving on to explain the mechanisms for compliance, reporting, and verification. Each instruction, carefully crafted, demonstrated Mom's deep understanding of human nature and the necessity of foresight. The inheritance was not merely financial, it was procedural, behavioral, moral. He felt a chill. This was no ordinary will. This was a carefully constructed narrative in which Mom was both author and arbiter. Their assumptions had been convenient illusions, and now they were being dismantled one careful phrase at a time. A subtle tremor passed through him as he realized the depth of misjudgment. Mom hadn't simply allocated assets. She had designed a system in which her values, discipline, responsibility, foresight, and integrity were inseparable from the inheritance. It was a revelation that reshaped the room. The siblings' earlier jokes, their whispered strategies, their smug anticipations, all seemed almost naive now, relics of a mindset that had failed to consider consequence. The realization settled like gravity, unmovable and undeniable. He could no longer mask the shift in his perception. His posture straightened not with pride, but with the dawning acknowledgement that he had miscalculated entirely. Mom's clause wasn't a trap in the malicious sense. It was a revelation, a test of alignment between values and entitlement. The inheritance, previously assumed as a right, had become a reflection of merit and discernment. And merit, he now understood, required more than presence. It demanded engagement, understanding, and demonstration of foresight. The room was heavy with tension now, the kind that makes time stretch, forcing every participant to confront reality. He sat silently, fingers tapping lightly on his knee, trying to process what had just unfolded. Each word of the clause replayed in his mind, not as sentences, but as implications, as challenges, as rules of a game he had never realized he was playing. His confidence, once so unshakable, had eroded completely, leaving only a gnawing sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. The assumption that Mom's will was a formality, the idea that inheritance was guaranteed, was gone. In its place was clarity. Reward follows responsibility. Entitlement is meaningless without accountability. The siblings' expressions mirrored his growing unease. A quiet, almost imperceptible shift occurred. The smirks faded, the whispers ceased, and all eyes were on the lawyer as she detailed exactly what compliance entailed. The clause was cunningly structured. Deadlines, demonstrations of initiative, verifiable contributions, and proof of character. No one could claim ignorance. No one could feign innocence. Mom had anticipated every common argument, every manipulation tactic, every entitlement-driven assumption. Her foresight was surgical, precise, and absolute. He glanced at the others, silently weighing their reactions. Some faces were red with embarrassment, others pale with shock. Every instinct screamed to reclaim control, to manipulate, to twist circumstances back in their favor. But each instinct was checked, stymied by the clarity and precision of the clause. He realized something fundamental. Mom had not only protected her assets, but had neutralized the predictable strategies of entitlement. She had anticipated the human element, the arrogance, the overconfidence, the expectation of inheritance as a right, and designed a system that rendered all of it powerless. The lawyer continued, reading the enforcement measures, the contingencies, the specific conditions under which each asset could be accessed or transferred. The structure was elegant, almost beautiful in its precision. It was clear that Mom had devoted tremendous care to ensuring her legacy reflected more than material wealth. It reflected wisdom, strategy, and foresight. Every stipulation reinforced her values. Every requirement tested understanding and diligence. The inheritance was no longer merely about money. It was about demonstrating alignment with principles that she had deemed essential. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, feeling the weight of every assumption he had carried. For years, he had believed that familiarity and proximity granted privilege. He had relied on predictability, assuming that the estate would reward presence rather than action. And now, in that moment, he recognized the folly of such thinking. Mom's clause was not just a legal instrument, it was a mirror reflecting the reality of his character. It demanded active engagement, thoughtful planning, and consistent demonstration of responsibility. Nothing could be claimed passively, nothing could be assumed. The siblings whispered amongst themselves, frantic attempts to reinterpret the language, to find a path back to the comfortable certainty they had taken for granted. Each murmur was an acknowledgement of the unexpected, the unprecedented. They were forced to confront the fact that Mom had seen through years of entitlement, had anticipated their behaviors, and had accounted for every predictable move. The realization settled uncomfortably in the room. The inheritance was not theirs by default. It was theirs only through merit, discipline, and demonstration of values. He felt a mixture of frustration and awe. Frustration at the loss of control. Awe at the intelligence and foresight that had gone into crafting such a clause. Mom had not only ensured that her estate was protected, but she had orchestrated a revelation of character, a test of values, and a redistribution system that rewarded foresight and diligence over expectation. It was a master class in planning, execution, and insight into human nature. The more he understood it, the more respect he felt for the subtle genius of her design. The lawyer paused to allow questions, but the room was silent. Not because they were satisfied or reassured, but because comprehension had momentarily silenced them. They were absorbing the implications, recalculating strategies, and realizing that conventional tactics, pleading, persuasion, intimidation, were ineffective against a well-structured, premeditated clause. Mom's intelligence had created a system where entitlement was irrelevant, where control was exercised through clarity and foresight rather than confrontation or aggression. He reflected on the irony. The very arrogance that had fueled their certainty was now the reason for their hesitation. They had assumed that the inheritance was a given, that Mom's preferences could be ignored, and that entitlement was sufficient. Each assumption had been a misstep, each expectation a vulnerability. The clause did not punish them. It revealed the truth of their preparedness or lack thereof. Mom had turned the legal process into a subtle examination of character, and the results were immediately visible in the expressions around the table. Whispers resumed, quieter now, calculated. Siblings discussed logistics, timelines, and possible ways to demonstrate compliance. He realized with a pang that the room's dynamics had shifted permanently. Authority, once assumed by birth and familiarity, now lay with the document, with the clause, with the structure of foresight. No argument, no plea, no manipulation could alter the terms without direct engagement and fulfillment of the stipulated conditions. The lesson was stark. Preparation and alignment with principles outweighed privilege and expectation. The clause continued to unfold in the lawyer's reading, each provision revealing further layers of strategy, insight, and moral instruction. Conditional allocations, phased distributions, performance criteria, all designed not to obstruct, but to illuminate. He noticed subtle details he had overlooked, metrics of engagement, evidence of initiative, requirements that aligned inheritance with real-world action rather than passive assumption. Mom had converted legal text into a roadmap, a curriculum, and a mirror simultaneously. It was brilliance disguised as bureaucracy, wisdom encoded in routine. He felt a shift within himself. Initial frustration gave way to reflection. Mom's clause was more than a test. It was an education, a revelation, a challenge. It required that he step beyond assumptions, abandon entitlement, and engage in intentional, demonstrable action. The room, heavy with tension, was now also heavy with comprehension. Every glance, every shift in posture, every silent calculation bore witness to the quiet but powerful influence of foresight executed with precision. He sat back, letting the words of the clause sink deeper. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a gnawing realization. Everything he had believed about entitlement was irrelevant. Mom hadn't left them money. She had left them a test, a challenge disguised as a legacy. Each requirement, each condition, each measure of compliance was designed to reveal who truly understood responsibility, foresight, and consequence. The others around the table were scrambling, whispering, trying to interpret, negotiate, or bend the rules in ways the document explicitly prevented. Their certainty had dissolved, replaced by anxiety, doubt, and the slow recognition that Mom had outsmarted them all. He glanced at the siblings, watching the subtle cracks in their composure. One leaned forward, brow furrowed, muttering about fairness and oversight. Another crossed arms tightly, as if physical constraint could counteract the legal precision of the clause. Each reaction was predictable, exactly as Mom must have intended. She had built a structure that was not only robust but revealing. It exposed arrogance, impatience, and the assumption of default entitlement in a way that left no room for denial. Her legacy wasn't just the assets. It was the clarity she enforced, the lessons encoded in legal language that could not be ignored. The lawyer's voice remained steady, authoritative, and dispassionate. She wasn't there to adjudicate behavior. She was there to communicate the terms, the structure, and the expectations embedded in the will. Every pause, every carefully enunciated word reinforced the gravity of the moment. It was more than a reading. It was a performance of precision, a demonstration of foresight, and an unveiling of consequences. The clause was not punitive. It was revelatory. It showed, without question, the misalignment between assumption and reality, between expectation and responsibility. He felt a shift in himself, too. Anger and disbelief had begun to morph into reflection. Mom's foresight was undeniable, brilliant in its simplicity and exactness. She had anticipated every behavior, every overconfidence, every misplaced assumption. The inheritance was no longer merely about the money. It was a mirror, showing what each sibling was capable of, what they valued, and how far they were willing to act with integrity and diligence. The realization was humbling, almost awe-inspiring. What had seemed like a joke in their eyes was, in truth, a carefully orchestrated revelation of character. The clauses were layered, cascading one into another, each dependent on the successful execution of the previous. Distribution of assets was phased, conditional upon demonstrating initiative, accountability, and evidence of meaningful action. It was no longer about who could claim the most. It was about who could prove themselves worthy, who could navigate complexity, who could rise above mere expectation and entitlement. The room's energy shifted as the implications settled. Laughter had vanished, replaced by a quiet, intense focus. He could feel the weight of understanding pressing down, shaping thoughts, forcing recalibration. The lawyer detailed the mechanisms for verification and compliance. Evidence had to be documented, reports submitted, actions recorded. Deadlines were explicit. Oversight was precise. It was as if every detail had been anticipated and codified. The simplicity of the wording belied the complexity of its impact. Mom had not only distributed wealth, she had distributed responsibility, created accountability structures, and most importantly, revealed the inadequacies of assumption. Every instinct to manipulate, coerce, or rely on familial privilege was neutralized. He realized, with an uncomfortable clarity, that she had designed this moment not just to provide inheritance, but to instruct, illuminate, and challenge. He caught himself thinking about his own past assumptions, how easily he had believed in default rights, in predictable outcomes, in the ease of entitlement. And now, in that room, confronted with the deliberate structure of foresight, he understood how little preparation, initiative, or reflection he had brought to the table. The will was a mirror, reflecting both opportunity and inadequacy. Those who failed to recognize the demand for action and accountability would be left behind. Those who engaged deliberately would find reward. Mom's clause was less about wealth and more about wisdom applied in practice. Whispers broke out again, low and hurried. Siblings compared interpretations, attempted to anticipate the lawyer's next reading, and explored avenues for negotiation. But the clarity of the clause rendered most strategies moot. Mom had embedded foresight into the structure itself. Compliance was measurable. Outcomes were verifiable. Entitlement alone was worthless. The room was thick with tension, a palpable recognition that control had shifted from assumption to design. They were participants in a system they had never expected to encounter, and the consequences were immediate and inescapable. He felt a new sense of perspective emerge. The initial frustration faded into acknowledgement. Mom's intelligence, patience, and foresight had created not just a document, but a lesson, a test, a framework for understanding consequence. He could no longer see the will as merely an inheritance. It was a mirror, a measure, a revelation. What mattered was no longer what he expected to receive, but how he engaged with the requirements, how he acted with foresight, and how he demonstrated understanding. The realization was liberating in its clarity, though humbling in its implications. The lawyer moved on to the final sections, summarizing the contingencies, stipulations, and verification processes. Each detail reinforced what had already become painfully clear. Entitlement alone was meaningless. Initiative, alignment with values, and consistent action were the only paths to fulfillment. He watched as the siblings digested this reality, their reactions ranging from silent calculation to visible frustration. Each was confronted with the same truth he faced. The inheritance was no longer a matter of assumption. It was a measure of character and action. The room, once buzzing with anticipation and certainty, had transformed into a crucible of comprehension and recalibration. He realized that the initial shock was only the beginning. The clause, seemingly simple on paper, had layered consequences that unfolded in ways none of them had anticipated. Each condition, each requirement, was designed not merely to distribute wealth, but to test adaptability, foresight, and understanding. The inheritance was no longer a passive reward. It demanded engagement, thought, and deliberate action. For the first time, he saw the full extent of Mom's strategy. She had accounted for their assumptions, their arrogance, their predictable reliance on entitlement, and she had crafted a structure that neutralized all of it. The lawyer continued reading, detailing the documentation required for compliance. Every action, every initiative had to be verifiable, observable, and measurable. Deadlines were explicit. Oversight mechanisms were clear. It wasn't arbitrary, nor was it designed to punish. It was designed to reveal. The room had shifted from casual expectation to intense focus. Each sibling leaned forward, scanning the document, analyzing each phrase, attempting to anticipate every step they would need to take. The smirk that had dominated his face vanished, replaced by the kind of concentration born of sudden responsibility. He could feel the implications settling into the room. What had seemed like a joke, a playful challenge, was now a demanding blueprint for action. Each person present had to reconsider assumptions, priorities, and strategies. He understood that the inheritance wasn't merely about wealth. It was about alignment with values, demonstration of foresight, and proof of consistent effort. It was a reflection of Mom's understanding of character and consequence. The realization was both humbling and sobering. She had created a system where only those capable of reflection, planning, and action could succeed. Whispers circulated, attempts to reinterpret, negotiate, or find loopholes. But the lawyer's clear, deliberate reading left little room for manipulation. Every requirement had been phrased with precision. Each contingency accounted for predictable human behavior. Mom had engineered the document not to be subverted, but to illuminate, challenge, and guide. He noticed subtle reactions in the siblings: furrowed brows, pursed lips, averted gazes, all indications that the realization was sinking in. They were confronted with the truth that privilege alone was insufficient. He reflected on his own preparation, or lack thereof. For years, he had assumed inheritance was a matter of position, familiarity, and expectation. He had relied on certainty born from family dynamics rather than earned understanding. And now, faced with a clause that demanded engagement and foresight, he recognized how fragile those assumptions were. The inheritance had become a mirror, exposing both potential and inadequacy. Mom's intelligence and foresight had transformed what they believed would be a simple formality into a profound lesson in responsibility. The lawyer explained the phased distribution of assets, contingent on successful demonstration of each requirement. It wasn't immediate gratification. It required planning, documentation, and accountability. He realized, with a mixture of awe and unease, that the clause had been constructed to teach not just compliance, but strategy, patience, and reflection. It demanded that they act with intention, consider consequences, and prove capability over time. The process itself became part of the inheritance, an educational and transformative experience embedded within legal language. He glanced at his siblings, noting the shift in energy. Confidence had given way to tension, certainty to apprehension. Some whispered frantic strategies, attempting to reclaim perceived control, but the clarity and precision of the clause rendered many tactics ineffective. Mom had anticipated behavior patterns, assumed predictability, and accounted for human flaws. The inheritance was no longer a matter of passive claim. It was earned through reflection, foresight, and deliberate action. Every instinct to coerce, charm, or manipulate was neutralized. The room fell into tense silence as the weight of comprehension settled. He noticed a subtle realization dawning on everyone. Entitlement alone was meaningless. The clause had exposed the inadequacy of assumptions and the necessity of active engagement. He felt a pang of respect for Mom's foresight. She had anticipated overconfidence, corrected for arrogance, and structured a legacy that rewarded initiative and foresight above all. The inheritance had become not just a reward but a test, a reflection of character and understanding. He considered the long-term implications. Compliance wasn't a one-time demonstration. It required sustained action. The inheritance would unfold over time, conditional on consistent engagement. He realized that Mom had engineered not only a legal framework but a life lesson. Success, reward, and legacy were contingent on preparation, foresight, and character. The clause didn't merely redistribute wealth. It reshaped behavior, clarified priorities, and revealed the true measure of readiness. It was subtle genius, disguised as ordinary legal text. Whispers subsided, replaced by calculated discussion. Siblings examined the logistics, deadlines, and evidence requirements. He understood that each person's approach would determine their outcomes. The clause had neutralized arbitrary expectation and replaced it with measured accountability. Mom's intelligence had ensured that the inheritance would reflect competence, foresight, and alignment with values. It was an elegant solution, a legal instrument, a moral test, and a revelation of character all at once. The room had transformed entirely. Where once there had been casual expectation and smug confidence, Now there was focus, calculation, and quiet apprehension. He noticed how even the smallest gestures, tightened grips on chairs, restless shifting, avoided eye contact, reflected the dawning comprehension of what Mom had orchestrated. Her clause wasn't merely legal text. It was a master class in foresight, human behavior, and strategy. The more he considered it, the more he understood that her brilliance lay not in the amount of wealth, but in the precision with which she had designed a structure to reveal truth. The lawyer paused, letting the room absorb the implications. Compliance was a living process. Deadlines were real, evidence had to be verifiable, and initiative was mandatory. Each sibling, now confronting the reality that entitlement was irrelevant, processed the situation differently. Some whispered in rapid bursts, frantically recalculating potential strategies. Others were silent, absorbing the clarity, realizing that the inheritance was no longer about their expectations, but about their ability to demonstrate foresight and consistent action. He reflected quietly on the years of assumptions he had carried. For decades, he had believed proximity, familiarity, and age granted him privileges. Mom's clause demolished all of that. It was not punitive, it was revelatory. It revealed the inadequacy of assumption, the necessity of action, and the subtle interplay between foresight and reward. He recognized that the inheritance was not simply a transfer of wealth, it was a mirror of character and readiness. And for the first time, he understood how deeply Mom had thought about the human elements of legacy. The siblings' murmurs escalated, but the lawyer's calm authority controlled the pace. Each sentence she read reinforced the necessity of engagement. The clause was clear, precise, and unavoidable. The inheritance had become a challenge, a combination of strategy, planning, and accountability. The room, once confident and casual, was now a crucible of comprehension and recalibration. He could see the realization spreading. Privilege alone was meaningless. Preparedness, initiative, and integrity were now the currencies of inheritance. He shifted in his chair, noting the subtle changes in posture around the table. Where there had been arrogance and certainty, now there was tension and calculation. He realized that Mom's clause had not just redistributed wealth, it had redistributed power. Control had shifted from assumption to design. Every instinct to manipulate, to charm, or to coerce had been neutralized. The framework she had created ensured that only deliberate, thoughtful engagement could yield results. Each sibling faced the same reality, and the room was unified by comprehension, not agreement. The lawyer moved on to explain contingencies, phased distributions, and verification processes. Each requirement reinforced the notion that entitlement alone was irrelevant. Actions, measurable outcomes, and sustained initiative were now the determinants of reward. He considered how cleverly Mom had embedded these mechanisms. The clause demanded accountability without being overtly punitive. It rewarded foresight without requiring theatrical effort, and it exposed overconfidence with surgical precision. This was strategic genius, disguised as routine legal procedure. Whispers continued, but now they were quieter, more deliberate, analytical rather than casual. Siblings discussed timelines, documentation, and strategies for compliance. He realized that the inheritance had become a living system. Each action, each demonstration of initiative, each completed task would influence outcomes. Mom had transformed wealth into an instrument of learning, alignment, and character evaluation. The lesson was clear. Preparation, foresight, and engagement outweighed expectation and entitlement in a way that was undeniable. He felt a mixture of awe and humility. The clause was more than a legal instrument. It was an insight into human behavior, a reflection of values, and a roadmap for meaningful action. Mom had anticipated overconfidence, accounted for human flaws, and created a system that revealed competence over presumption. The inheritance had become a test, a framework, and a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw the consequences of assumptions unexamined, the cost of relying on entitlement, and the necessity of intentional engagement. The lawyer continued with the final provisions, emphasizing the long-term nature of compliance and verification. The inheritance would not be immediate, nor would it be guaranteed without sustained action. Each sibling now faced the reality that success required deliberate, consistent effort. The room was charged with reflection, apprehension, and strategy. He realized that Mom had designed not just a distribution of assets, but a system of accountability, foresight, and revelation, ensuring that wealth would follow preparedness rather than assumption. He reflected on the transformation of the room's energy. From confidence and casual certainty, it had shifted to focus, calculation, and silent acknowledgement of reality. Every instinct to manipulate, coerce, or rely on assumed privilege had been neutralized. Mom's clause had created a structure in which the inheritance was a reflection of readiness, foresight, and character. And in that moment, he understood the subtle brilliance of her design. Clarity embedded in complexity, foresight disguised as routine, and truth revealed without confrontation. He leaned back, letting the full weight of comprehension settle in. The clause was more than a legal directive. It was a revelation, a quiet assertion of intelligence, foresight, and strategy. He realized that every assumption he had held about entitlement, expectation, and family dynamics had been carefully accounted for, anticipated, and neutralized by Mom's foresight. The inheritance was no longer a matter of position or familiarity. It was a measure of action, alignment, and sustained demonstration of responsibility. Every instinct that had guided him for years, relying on proximity, charm, or expectation, was now irrelevant. The siblings exchanged hurried glances, each processing the implications differently. Some whispered, formulating strategies, trying to bend reality to their favor. Others were silent, absorbing the clarity, feeling the sting of recognition. The inheritance demanded engagement, thoughtfulness, and foresight. The lawyer maintained her calm, steady reading, enforcing the rhythm of comprehension. The room's energy had shifted completely. Entitlement had been replaced with calculation, confidence with apprehension, and casual certainty with deliberate reflection. He considered the clause in depth. The phased distribution, the requirements for verification, the measurable outcomes, all were designed to reward initiative, foresight, and responsibility over passive assumption. The inheritance had become an active process, a living system that exposed character and demanded alignment with values. The realization was profound. Mom had created a structure where privilege alone was powerless, where action and accountability dictated outcomes. He felt both frustration at the challenge and awe at the brilliance of its design. The lawyer outlined contingencies, explaining how deviations, delays, or failures to comply would affect distribution. It was meticulous, precise, and unwavering. He recognized that Mom had anticipated every predictable behavior, accounted for every instinctual reaction, and designed a system where each individual's success depended entirely on their own deliberate engagement. Whispers and low murmurs echoed around the room as siblings realized that the inheritance was no longer a passive expectation, but a test of judgment, character, and foresight. He reflected on his own reactions over the past minutes, the smirks, the assumptions, the casual confidence, and felt a twinge of humility. Mom's clause had stripped all of that away, leaving only clarity and the demand for action. It was brilliant in its simplicity. The inheritance was conditional, precise, and transparent. It demanded initiative, documentation, and accountability. And yet, it was not punitive. It was instructive, revealing, and transformative. He understood now that Mom had used legal text not merely to distribute wealth, but to impart wisdom. The siblings were adjusting to the reality, recalculating strategies, evaluating timelines, and discussing verification methods. The initial shock had evolved into planning, but it was tempered by the awareness that missteps would have real consequences. Each requirement in the clause had been carefully crafted to reward thoughtful action while exposing overconfidence and entitlement. The room, once filled with casual expectation, now vibrated with the quiet intensity of strategic calculation. He realized the subtle genius of Mom's foresight. She had embedded not only conditions but lessons, not only distribution rules but moral measures, not only instructions but revelations of character. Each provision was deliberate, designed to challenge assumptions, test initiative, and reveal the capacity for alignment with values. The inheritance had become more than wealth. It was an instrument of insight, a reflection of foresight, and a measure of deliberate engagement. As the lawyer continued reading, he noted the elegance of the system. Compliance wasn't about appearances, it was about verifiable action. Entitlement was irrelevant. Initiative, consistency, and alignment were everything. The room's dynamics had shifted entirely. Power was no longer assumed by position or familiarity, but earned through understanding, planning, and deliberate effort. He felt a mix of respect and apprehension. The inheritance was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate capability, responsibility, and foresight in a way that no one had anticipated. He caught himself thinking about the broader implications. Mom had not simply written a will. She had created a living system that revealed the truth of character and competence. She had anticipated overconfidence, accounted for assumptions, and crafted a structure that neutralized entitlement. The inheritance was now a reflection of preparation and alignment rather than position or familiarity. The realization was humbling, and he recognized that the brilliance of her design lay not in the wealth itself, but in the foresight, clarity, and strategy encoded within the clause. The lawyer concluded the reading with a final overview of contingencies, deadlines, and verification processes. The room fell silent, the air thick with comprehension. Every sibling, including him, understood the stakes and the expectations. The inheritance was no longer a passive gift. It was a measure of foresight, initiative, and alignment with values. He realized fully that Mom's clause had transformed not only the distribution of assets, but the very understanding of responsibility, preparation, and consequence. The silence in the room was profound, almost tangible. 7,000 words of understanding could be felt, though unspoken, in the tension that hung in the air. Every sibling, including him, now grasped the magnitude of Mom's foresight. What had seemed like a simple inheritance, a matter of expectation, had been revealed as an intricate system designed to test, reveal, and reward character. The clause wasn't arbitrary, nor punitive. It was strategic, precise, and unyielding. He understood now that entitlement alone was meaningless. Action, foresight, and alignment with values were the only true currencies that could unlock the inheritance. He looked at the lawyer, nodding her calm composure. She wasn't there to intimidate or arbitrate beyond the will's text. Her presence enforced clarity. Her reading made evident the weight of every word, every condition, every consequence. The clause had shifted power from assumption to structure. That realization settled heavily on him. Mom had not only anticipated their behavior, she had designed a system where competence, foresight, and integrity determined outcomes. The inheritance was now a reflection of alignment with her principles, rather than a reward for proximity or familiarity. As the room absorbed this reality, he felt a mix of awe, frustration, and clarity. Mom had embedded not just legal obligations but moral insight. The inheritance required accountability, initiative, and sustained engagement. Each sibling now faced the undeniable truth that the estate was conditional, contingent on performance rather than assumption. The laughter, the scoffing, the casual certainty, all were replaced by calculation, apprehension, and reflection. The clause was more than a legal instrument. It was a revelation, a test, and a lesson all at once. He thought back to the years of assumptions and expectations. How easily he had believed that inheritance was a matter of course, that familiarity equaled entitlement, that the patterns of family dynamics guaranteed outcomes. Mom had dismantled all of that with a few carefully chosen words, a structure of foresight that left no room for ambiguity. The inheritance had become a mirror, reflecting character, preparedness, and alignment with values. He realized that the true legacy was not the wealth itself, but the wisdom encoded in its distribution. The lawyer outlined the final mechanisms for verification and accountability. Phased distributions, documentation, deadlines, and measures of initiative were all precise and deliberate. Every detail had been anticipated, every predictable behavior accounted for. The inheritance had become not just a reward, but a system of revelation. Who could adapt, who could engage, who could demonstrate foresight? The room had shifted entirely, from casual expectation to strategic comprehension. Every sibling now understood that success would require deliberate action, measured planning, and alignment with Mom's vision. He reflected on the brilliance of Mom's design. She had taken ordinary legal language and transformed it into a living system, a framework for measuring character, responsibility, and foresight. The inheritance was conditional, yes, but it was also instructive. Each provision was a test, a revelation, a demonstration of insight. He felt a growing respect for her intelligence, patience, and foresight. The room, tense and calculating, bore witness to a strategy that none of them could have anticipated, but all would now be compelled to navigate. The siblings exchanged calculated whispers, their expressions ranging from panic to reluctant acknowledgement. Some sought strategies, others froze, realizing the futility of relying on assumption or entitlement. He saw clearly how Mom had neutralized every predictable tactic: negotiation, coercion, charm, even familial pressure. The clause demanded engagement, foresight, and deliberate demonstration of capability. Power had shifted entirely from assumption to design, from expectation to measurable action. He understood the larger lesson unfolding before him. Mom's clause had transformed the inheritance into more than a transfer of wealth. It was a test, a moral framework, and a revelation of character. The room, once filled with laughter, scoffing, and certainty, was now defined by reflection, strategy, and the acknowledgement of a structured challenge. Entitlement was meaningless. Foresight, initiative, and alignment were everything. He felt humbled, challenged, and illuminated all at once. Finally, as the lawyer concluded her reading, the weight of comprehension settled fully. Every sibling, including him, now faced the undeniable reality. The inheritance was conditional, contingent, and purposeful. Mom had designed not just a will, but a system of foresight, accountability, and revelation. The lesson was clear. Assumptions could be shattered, entitlement could be neutralized, and clarity, preparation, and deliberate action determined outcomes. The inheritance was not merely wealth. It was a mirror, a test, and a testament to the power of strategic foresight. He exhaled slowly, realizing the full impact of the moment. Mom's brilliance was in the subtlety, the precision, and the foresight embedded in the clause. What had seemed like a joke, a casual surprise, was actually a carefully crafted mechanism to reveal, challenge, and reward character. The room had changed forever. Assumptions had been dismantled, entitlement neutralized, and clarity imposed. The inheritance was now a measure not of expectation, but of engagement, foresight, and alignment with values.